Hi, my name is Charlie Majorana, and I'm an artist working in rural Maryland. And my great joy is just playing around in the art studio with all the materials and tools and techniques. I'm also the author of the book Puttering Around the Art Studio, which contains all my best ideas and techniques. If you'd like to get a copy, it's available from Amazon, and I've included a link below. This video covers the technique I used to create the panels included on my Memorata sculpture. To create this sculpture, I used 6 of these panels mounted on a simple cube-shaped aluminum frame I welded together from square tubing. My intent was to create an effect where the viewer wondered what was going on behind the cloth. Now, I could have achieved a somewhat similar effect by simply coating styrofoam, or I could have actually just coated objects, but that would have achieved a totally different effect. I was inspired to try this technique by watching a friend, Peter Fuchs, make a skinned kayak, and using a similar technique, and also by watching a YouTube video on how custom sinks were made. Now let's talk about the materials you'll need if you'd like to make one of these panels. The first thing that you'll need is some spandex stretchy cloth. Now for the panels that I used for the sculpture, I used this cotton stretchy spandex blend. It has 10% spandex, and it's kind of like a cheesy t-shirt material. For the demo that I'll be doing, I decided to up my game a little bit, and I bought some 18% spandex that's a little bit stronger material. And these are pretty cheap and available from the local Joann store. The second thing you'll need is some plywood. And here I'm just using a piece of 3/4 inch plywood. You really could get away with 1/2 inch easily. It's just I had a nice piece of 3/4 laying around the shop. The next thing you'll need, of course, is some resin and some putty. And for this process, I'm using the cheapest resin and putty I can get my hands on, which happens to be the Bondo resin and putty that's sold by Home Depot and Lowe's. And you'll need probably to buy some extra hardener unless you're very careful about how you use it. You'll notice that in the when I do my demo, I'm putting on 1 coat of resin first, letting that harden up, and then putting on a coat of resin putty mix for my second coat. Now, you don't need very many tools to do this. The things that you'll really need are a mask and some gloves. The resin fumes are very obnoxious, and I have great ventilation here in my studio, but even then, when I'm using resin, I'll keep the door open to get rid of the fumes. And also, you really do need disposable gloves because the resin's very sticky, and you want to get it off your hands. I'll use a simple glue gun to glue the parts down onto the plywood. They don't have to be held very well because the cloth and the resin will help hold them in place. You'll need a stapler of some kind to staple the material down to the plywood. I'm using an air stapler, it just makes life easier. You'll also need a bunch of mixing containers, some stir sticks, and some chip brushes to apply the resin and the putty. Sometimes I'll use spring clips to help hold on the material, but usually the stapler is all you'll need. As a preview of what you'll be seeing during the demo, here are some pictures from when I was making the sculpture, showing you some panels with just the cloth stretched over them, the panels with the first coating of resin, and some panels with both the resin and the putty mixture. The first step in the process is to design what your layout's going to be. And I put some marks on my plywood just so that when I glue down the pieces, they'll be in the exact position I want. Now I'm going to do a very simple design for my demo. I've got 4 pieces of styrofoam, and I'm just going to lay them out kind of like this. But when I glue them down, I'll make sure I follow my guidelines so that the pieces are positioned correctly. So the next step is to glue down whatever I'm going to be using underneath the cloth. So my glue gun is hot. I've got my layout that I want to follow, and I'm going to now start just gluing things down. Now the next step is to staple the fabric over your layout. And so I'm going to put the cloth over and start at one corner and staple it down. There's a lot of stretch in the fabric, so you don't have to be too careful. Initial outside stapling, and it doesn't look like much right now because all we have are hills. We don't have any valleys in the design, and so I'll get the valleys in the design by putting staples between the objects. Now you could really use a lot of things to get valleys. I've used push pins. I've just taken sticks and nailed them down, very thin sticks. You could take wire, or you could take string, but you need to have definition in your design. So here, I'm satisfied with my initial rough stapling, and so I'm going to move on to getting some valleys in there. So the next step is to mix up some resin and hardener and paint on the first coat. I've raised up my panel off my cardboard by just putting a few upside down cups underneath it. So I just estimate about how much resin I'm going to need. Now, normally I'd have a mask on when I was doing this because of the smell, but because of the video, I'm not going to have a mask on. So, oops. And I'm just estimating about how much resin I think I'm going to need. Now, this resin is pretty cheap resin, and it dries a tan color, which is fine because I'm going to be painting it. There's no artwork underneath that has to shine through. So now I'm ready to mix my hardener with my, so I squirt in some hardener. Stir it up really well. Whereas the amount of hardener that you include isn't super important. If you use a little less, it just takes longer to harden up. But it is important that you mix it up well. I mixed it up well. And now I brush on a coat. Take one of my chip brushes and just slop on a coat. At this point, the first coat of resin has dried and it's amazingly stiff, and it's ready for the second coat. Now the second coat will consist of a 50-50 mix of hardener and resin. And what I'll do is I'll mix the hardeners with each of them and then combine them and stir them up together. First, put a little hardener in the putty. Then a little hardener in the resin. Mix them up. You can tell when the putty is thoroughly mixed when the color is uniform. It's very stiff and so it's hard to mix, but just keep at it. Mix up the resin with its hardener. Then pour them together. And mix the whole thing up. So here's the completed demo panel. It's not the most exciting panel in the world, but I hope that it demonstrated the technique. And here's an example of how I might choose to display one of these panels if I wasn't making a large sculpture. I thought I'd leave you with some design ideas in case you'd like to try this out. Here I split some mailing tubes in half and just sort of position them in some interesting ways. And here I've taken some styrofoam parts that I just bought at the local craft store and just laid them down, and some pieces of wire that I thought might make an interesting design. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, just give me a thumbs up. And if you want to see more of this kind of thing, just subscribe to my channel, and I'll let you know when I post new videos.